What's up, Guru Nation? Let's demystify clinical research.
Hey Guru Nation, thank you so much for watching. Make sure you like, subscribe, comment, share. It really means a lot to me. We're getting back to the fundamentals, back to the basics. You know, people have been putting comments on these videos, and one of them says, hey, you know what? Can you do a video on the contents of a binder, source binder, for individual subjects? What documents are included in the source documents for a particular patient? So, again, sponsored by Creo, this video. Shout out to Creo. I'm also sponsored by Inato for your biz dev needs, and I'm also sponsored by Versatrial to keep your studies organized. But this one's really about source. We use eSource, it's Creo. But before we even get into what a source document is, before we even get into why do we need source, okay, let's talk about what source is. Because a lot of people are going to say, and rightfully so, why don't we just enter the data directly on the EDC system? Why not? Well, if our job as researchers was just to collect data, that might be something worth looking into. I'm sure the industry would have done it. But you got to remember, this industry really prioritizes good clinical practice. So that means patient safety. That means, how do you document that good clinical practice was actually achieved at every visit? And even beyond that, how do you document protocol compliance was achieved at every visit? There's no way to do that properly by just taking study data and putting it in a database, which is an EDC system. So you got to remember, good clinical practice, patient safety was the protocol followed, right? Was it documented as per ALCOAC, which is attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, accurate, and complete? There's currently no way to do that without having source documentation at the individual subject level. That's it. You guys can argue with me all you want. You can argue in the comments. It's fine. But there's a lot more to clinical research than the data that it produces. That is, you're right, the data is the end product. But the process of getting that data, we have to keep the FDA and all the regulatory bodies ensured that good clinical practice is being followed. And I teach all of our CRA students about the importance of progress notes as documentation for PI oversight. Without progress notes, monitors would not be able to fully confirm critical elements of the protocol, such as eligibility, protocol compliance, patient safety. So when you wonder, why do we need source data, source documents? It's because of this good clinical practice, patient safety, PI oversight. These are all related things. So with that being said and that out of the way, what is a source document? A source document is where the data originates for a particular patient, starting at screening visit. And it starts with the informed consent form. So again, here's a perfect example of why it's not just enough to take the date that the patient signed the informed consent form and the time and put it into EDC and say, hey, you have a complete documentation that good clinical practice was followed. There's an element to good clinical practice called process of consent. I've talked about this in my videos before, but the process of consent needs to document that the patient understood that they had alternative choices, that they voluntarily joined this trial, that they were fully informed of the risk, benefits, potential side effects, that they actually understand, and it's documented, that they understand what the study is about and what their priorities are going to be as far as their participation in the study and what that entails for them. There's no way you can get this in the EDC system without having at least, at minimum, a checklist on the source documents. Or, better yet, a progress note. So we've discussed what this process of consent is before. I'm not going to get into that, but that's the first thing that goes on source documentation is that process of consent. By the way, it's not just at screening visits. Every study visit should be an opportunity to re-educate the patient about their voluntary participation in the study. Every study visit, there should be some form of documentation that the patient's still willing to comply, the patient's still willing to participate, and that informed consent was still done. Informed consent is not just achieved once and that's it. It's a continuous process. So that's probably the best, that's why I put at the beginning, the best example of why source documentation is needed at the individual subject level. Now, this is where every protocol varies, can I get into the specifics of what need to go in a source document for a particular study visit? There are elements that they all share, all studies. Informed consent is probably the most obvious one. But then you get into things where there also are similarities, right? Every study has an inclusion-exclusion criteria. Every study has a section for adverse events. Every study has a section for medical history. Every study has a section for usually vital signs. Every study has a section for labs. Every study typically has a section for ConMeds. So these are all things that are source. And yes, these things you can put into the EDC directly, but it's where the data originates first. So when a patient comes into an office, the way we do it for a study visit is one of the first things we do is we ask them, have there been changes to your medications since your last visit? So your ConMeds, meaning medications that are not study drugs, but that you are taking in addition to the study drug. And if that's a yes, then you check the box. If it's a no, you check that box. And now you can put why. So if they did have a change in medication, well, what happened? Well, I had a headache, so doctor gave me Excedrin. So I started taking Excedrin. Well, now, what do you have? You have an adverse event, because prior to your last study visit, you didn't have a headache. We looked, it's not part of your medical history, but now you have a headache, so this is now part of adverse event, which is another source documentation event that has been captured in the source. So again, the progress notes in this particular scenario are important because a coordinator or a PI or a sub-I, whomever, somebody at the site should be writing a narrative to paint the picture for what the Excedrin is for. And it should be in there that, hey, it's for a headache, but the PI deems this a mild adverse event. The adverse events can get graded too. Serious adverse events can get graded as well, but the adverse events can get graded. And how do we know that an adverse event is actually not a serious adverse event? How do we know that this patient didn't have a migraine that was so bad that they ended up in the hospital for one night? Because that would be a SAE. So there's no way to know this unless someone's documenting it at the site level, the narrative of what happened, right? How do we also know that the migraine didn't impact the patient's investigational product compliance with the study drug? How do we know that they didn't feel so bad that day that they just skipped their investigational product? Again, you don't know unless it's documented, and these are things that the EDC system itself are not refined enough to capture this information. So those are some of the common elements in a subject source document that are across multiple studies, right? The informed consent, the demographics, the medical history, the ConMeds, inclusion-exclusion criteria, labs, vitals. I've never worked on a study that didn't have vitals. I have worked on studies that didn't have a labs, believe it or not, but still, 90% of studies will have labs. But now, all these things, all these different elements have their own protocol specific characteristics. So, medical history, perfect example. Some studies, I'm looking at a patient right now, they have major depressive disorder. Some studies actually won't allow patients with MDD to be in the study. So it's not enough to document, okay, patient has major depressive disorder. You also have to compare it to the inclusion-exclusion criteria, which is also embedded in the source documents. At least it should be. So in my study here on the inclusion-exclusion criteria, we have about 18 inclusion criteria and 55 exclusion criteria. So this patient with depression, somebody at the site, ideally the coordinator, the PI, the sub-I, the quality assurance, the monitor, ideally all these people, they're all looking at the IE criteria and they're saying, okay, MDD, is it part of the inclusion-exclusion criteria? Let's check really quickly. And yes, you could check it on the protocol and it doesn't have to be part of the source, but why not include it in your study workflow as part of the source to make it easier to comply with the protocol? Because what I've found is if there are things that are not listed in the source is supposed to be designed in a way that it assists the researchers in conducting their visits. So the source has to be designed properly. This is another reason why I like our service, DSCS, where we help clients get studies. We also help design their source documents for them. Creo does the same thing too. Creo has a marketplace where they can sell you the source templates for basically any study that's in their system. So having a properly designed source document template is the way to ensure protocol compliance, which every study, right, every single study is in jeopardy of somebody making a mistake on protocol compliance. And again, just putting the data in the EDC is the first layer. The protocol compliance, the patient safety, the good clinical practice aspects, these are all what is important for ensuring that good clinical practice is followed and that the study is a success from the perspective of patient safety, which is really what it's all about. Yes, we do produce data at the end of the day, but every study is different. Every study has nuances, and while there might be similarities, there are also extreme variabilities from study to study. Now, there is another element to source that cannot be easily captured in EDC, and it has to do with patient's medical history, and it has to do with the confirmation of the diagnosis of whatever therapeutic area the study is studying. So if a patient has osteoarthritis of the knee, there usually is a place in the source. And why is it in the source? Because again, it's usually in the inclusion criteria that you have documented proof that the patient has been diagnosed with this therapeutic condition for X period of time. That X period of time could be new, or it could be a year, it could be longer. So, how do you capture this stuff? Well, you can obtain a verbal report from the patient and put it in their patient's medical history in the source. That's one way. But good clinical practice would say you still need to find supporting medical documentation of this diagnosis. Now, sometimes there are imaging tests, sometimes there are blood tests. So an example of a blood test would be someone with diabetes that has uncontrolled diabetes. Well, you can take the patient's verbal report and write it down in the source as part of their medical history, but then you won't know until you get the lab results back, was their A1C really above 6.5 or not? And a lot of times these studies, they'll have elements of the inclusion-exclusion criteria that depend on lab results. Another good example is osteoarthritis. They depend on X-ray images, and somebody centrally somebody at the sponsor looking at the x-ray results and giving a grading criteria for the x-ray images. So is it a KL2? Is it a KL3? These are specifically for osteoarthritis of the knee. Okay, well, in those cases, those reports are good enough if the site cannot obtain the patient's medical history. A verbal report and those lab results typically suffice. Now, a lot of the times, the patients come from the PI's own private practice or the academic medical center's private practice. So there's a whole history of medical documents associated with this patient. So now the site can put relevant information from that patient's medical file into the source. And they got to follow their SOPs. Do you need to redact the private health information, or do you just leave it as is? Do you put all of it? Do you put some of it? That's all in your SOPs. That's for the site specific policy to figure that out. And that's also for the sponsors and CROs to determine how much information they need. So as good clinical practice, you typically want a diagnosis and you want a list of current medications that the patient's taking. Whether it's from a verbal report, but ideally it's better to have a documented proof. Now, a lot of these medications are not going to be allowed in the study that the patient is currently taking. I have several studies where patients need to wash off of certain meds before they get randomized. And if you haven't seen it, go check out the randomization visit video I did. How do you put this in EDC? How do you paint this narrative in the EDC of which medications the patient needs to come off of, which ones where the PI had a conversation with the patient about it, which ones, sometimes the patients need to be switched to a different class of medications in order to qualify or to remain eligible for the study. How do you know all this by just entering medications in an EDC? You really can't. So this is again where the progress notes in the source paint the picture, whether it's painting the picture to the monitor, to the auditor, or whomever it may be. The story needs to be told about what happened to this patient in regards to the medications as it pertains to them washing off of a certain med or being eligible for a certain study. So that's another example of why source I don't think can ever be fully replaced unless we figure out a way in the EDC to make the EDC more robust to where we can document notes like this. But now you're blurring the line between eSource and EDC, which, by the way, my sponsor Creo is already doing. So there's people already working on this stuff, but as of right now, 2023, June 2023, that's the way it is. Physical exam, that's usually done at every visit, at every screening visit. Vital signs, okay? There are variations of vital signs between studies. So blood pressure, height, weight, heart rate, those are common. But sometimes a study wants vital signs 5 minutes apart. So they want standing blood pressure, they want sitting blood pressure 5 minutes apart. Other times they want it in triplicate, 5, 10, 15. Other times they want them standing, sitting, standing. Other times they want them laying down all 3 times. So how do you know? You can't just put whatever you feel like in your study source. You have to go by the protocol. And this is where oftentimes when sites are creating source, the EDC screenshots are helpful because you could reverse engineer the EDC screenshots to see what data the sponsor ultimately captures and reverse engineer it back into your study workflow. We do this all the time at our site so that you can keep your staff on the right track as the visit's going on. And you can modify your source anytime as a site. We do it all the time. We notice, hey, why do we have, like in one particular study we have right now, we have height and weight as part of the physical, but only the PI or the sub-I can do the physical exam. So what we've been stumbling across is Our PI or sub-I has to do height and weight, which is typically not done by them, it's done by study coordinators. So we had to move the height and weight to the vital signs section so that the coordinators can do it, because the physical exam was only for investigators. So little things like that, sites can always modify, and it varies from study to study. Another common one is ECG. Most studies require ECG, electrocardiogram, but sometimes they want just one, sometimes they want triplicate, sometimes they want before the study drug was administered and then 10 minutes after. Same thing with blood draws. Sometimes they want PK, samples drawn 5 minutes after the investigational product was administered, 10, 15, 20. You have no way of knowing all of this unless you follow the protocol. So there's elements of source that are the same, but the details is where it's always in the protocol, and that's why no two studies have identical source visits, ever. I've never seen two studies, even long-term extension studies of previous existing studies, are they ever the same. Now, there are other things in the source document as well that we need to get into, and they typically revolve around investigational product accountability. So these are subject source as well. So remember, there's the master investigational product accountability log, which is technically a regulatory item, but then there's a subject specific investigational product accountability, and that's at each subject specific level. So IP accountability is another huge element of source documentation, that it's not just enough to put in EDC, yes, patient was compliant with their drug. Well, how many pills were returned? Or what were the situations around them dosing? Maybe it was an infusion at the clinic that day. Well, what was the situation around that? What time was it done? Who did it? Remember ALCOAC. Let's just not forget about these terms that we learned. They all integrate into one another. ALCOAC, GCP, and protocol compliance, and patient safety, and the data itself. These all are elements that integrate into source documentation. So again, typically progress notes are helpful for these things. And there are elements of source that overlap into regulatory, and vice versa. IP accountability is one, because like I said, master IP accountability is technically a regulatory item. It's in most investigator site files. But subject-specific IP accountability is technically a source documentation at the subject level. But those two impact each other. A change in one will make a change in the other, right? Same thing with serious adverse events. Most SAEs need to be reported to the sponsor and the IRB. Well, that's technically a regulatory action item, but also it's at an individual subject source level. So it's all about good documentation. It's all about painting a narrative. It's all about fixing the situation to where ALCOAC, good clinical practice, protocol compliance, and everything else just runs smoothly. And at the end of the day, you create an easy, streamlined approach for coordinators and investigators to run the specific study visit. Now, we haven't even discussed queries, and I'm going to touch up on queries in a bit. But EDCs, okay, if you haven't worked in this study, EDCs often get triggered either by the coordinator, by the CRAs, which are the monitors, or by the data manager, or sometimes auto queries. Well, that means more information needs to be gathered from the source in order to answer this query properly. Is the information correct as is? We don't know. We need to go back and look at the source. And this is where progress notes and detailed descriptions of what happened during certain assessments can help someone answer these queries, which, by the way, often need to be addressed a year after the actual visit was conducted. Yes, we have had queries a year or more removed from when the actual source was captured. So imagine if there's a brand new coordinator at the site in charge of answering these queries. how are they going to know the answer unless there was a detailed description on the source of what occurred? So unless we get rid of queries, which data management I don't think we'll ever want to do, we can't get rid of progress notes, and we can't get rid of proper source documentation. The two will never mesh perfectly well until we can just make it both one thing, source and EDC, which again, like I said, Creo is working on it. So hopefully this gives you a brief overview of what's in a source document. Again, it's all protocol specific, but there are elements that are shared by all studies, especially informed consent, demographics, medical history, con meds, progress notes, inclusion criteria, the process of informed consent, and then subject medical records. Like, subscribe, comment, share. Bye-bye.